Presidential powers, part 1 and 2, will go over the different powers that the president has constitutionally and how he's expanded those powers as defined by the Constitution using the provision of the Take Care Clause. So we're going to start with appointment powers as part of the judicial powers. So appointment powers, he has the ability to choose judges that will serve on the bench at the lower federal courts, the Circuit Court of Appeals, and of course justices on the Supreme Court. He's going to choose judges or justices that think like him. So if he's a conservative president, he's going to choose conservative judges. He's going to look for the best qualified, hopefully, and judges that look most like him that are young, so they'll stay in that office for a long time, up to 30, 40, sometimes in some cases 50 years on the bench. In fact, in 2017, Trump has appointed a judge to the lower federal district courts that's only 36. If he's healthy, he can definitely serve on the bench for the next 50 years. This is going to allow him to create a legacy and have long-lasting influence well beyond his terms in office. He can issue reprieves, pardons, and commutations, which could basically declare somebody innocent or tell somebody that they're not going to have to serve a sentence. We saw in 2017, earlier in September, where Trump had pardoned Arizona Sheriff or Maricopa County in Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio for his violation of judicial orders. So here, the silly picture of the presidential pardoning a turkey. That is some tradition that typically happens around Thanksgiving. But really, pardons have more of a important impact than that. And you can see that that the presidents have used pardons for things like Clinton pardoning his brother who was convicted with possession of cocaine, or Jimmy Carter pardoning his brother. Okay, foreign policy powers. This is a little bit more intense. This is more in dealing with what the framers had intended for the president to do with his power and his role in his office. So foreign policy powers, the formal is that he is chief diplomat. He is going to define the U.S.'s relationship with other countries. So Trump defining how are we going to relate to Russia. He wants to open up that relationship that we have with Russia, kind of thaw out that relationship and be more friendly. Whatever his reasons are, I'm not going to sit here and judge that right now. But that is his intention. What he tweets about Rocket Man, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, or how he's short and fat, that is defining our relationship with North Korea. But as chief diplomat, he has the power to recognize other countries and receive their ambassadors. So recognizing their right to be sovereign over their people. He negotiates the terms of treaties. He can withdraw from treaties, just like, for example, Trump not renewing the Iranian deal that was negotiated by Secretary of State John Kerry and during Barack Obama's administration with the leaders of Iran to try to get them to allow for international inspectors to make sure they're not developing nuclear weapons. Trump does not like that deal. He says that the U.S. is getting the bad end of that deal and that Iran is going to grow their economy and we're really not going to be able to stop them from developing a nuclear weapons program. The people who think that the Iran deal is a good deal believe that having inspectors in there for the next 10 to 15 years will allow us to see more about the Iranian military and their weapons capability. And lifting sanctions is a good thing because maybe we can establish some trade with them. He also appoints ambassadors and Secretary of States to carry out foreign policy on his behalf. But the president also has informal foreign policy powers. And the more that national security concerns grow, the more that the president is able to expand upon these informal powers, because people will defer to the president or look to the president to take care of any kind of crisis or issue, because he's one guy and he can make a quick decision. One example of an informal policy power or foreign policy power that he has is executive agreements. He can make an informal treaty, and the reason why these are informal is because they don't require Senate approval. The one check that Congress does have on this is that they can decide not to fund any agreement if the agreement is going to cost any money. They cannot appropriate the money for it. Military powers. This is where he gets a lot of flexibility in being able to expand those informal powers, especially in times of national crisis. He is the commander-in-chief, and it's important in a democracy to have a civilian control of the military. That way, we're not in a situation where the military is making decisions about whether or not we are going to go into war, or military commanders aren't necessarily making the last decisions on whether we're going to use nuclear weapons. If you have a civilian control of the military, then what you're doing is that's the final check for preventing a coup d'etat. So you can't have a military general necessarily come into Washington, take over, and then run the country as a military general. You saw, we were going to study Nigeria, and when you look at Nigeria, they had a lot of instances of military coup d'etats. Now, as commander-in-chief, he's going to choose where the troops move and which weapons to use. He gets to appoint the Secretary of Defense, who is key in helping him make decisions when it comes to the military. Where to deploy, how many troops to deploy, what sorts of weapons to use. Now, the president was using this power pretty much unchecked for a lot of the 1900s. And in one particular instance of the Gulf of Tonkin, in the Gulf of Tonkin, in the 1960s, right at the beginning of our true, defined conflict with Vietnam, even though we had been in Vietnam since Eisenhower and Kennedy, but we're talking about during LBJ's term. One of our destroyers, the USS Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese communist ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is outside of Vietnam. But we were in international waters. I'm not going to get into the controversy of what happens after that and whether or not we were justified in going into war or into a conflict, an extended conflict with Vietnam. If you are interested in learning more about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin and learning more about any kind of controversy surrounding that event or the incident, you can look on the U.S. Naval Institute's website, and they have a good rundown and breakdown of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, what we know for sure, and what we still have questions about. But in 1964, after the attack on our destroyer, LBJ goes to Congress and asks Congress if he could have the authority to send troops, and if he can spend as much time as he needs to push back the North Vietnamese aggression against the Southern, quote-unquote, democracy. And Congress just gave it to him. So basically, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was Congress's blank check to allow LBJ to commit an unlimited amount of troops, had an unlimited amount of money, more or less, and an unlimited amount of time in Vietnam. Until the War Powers Resolution. Now, the War Powers Resolution was Congress saying, oh, I think we might have made a mistake in 1964 by giving the president a blank check to conduct a conflict without a formal declaration of war. So during the Nixon administration, Congress tries to take some of the power back from the president's the president as commander-in-chief than they had given him in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So the War Powers Act outlines a few things that the president now has to do if he wants to engage the troops for an extended period of time. First, He never has to ask Congress for permission to deploy the troops. Let's get that clear. He never needs to go to Congress to say, may I deploy troops? He has the ability to do that. He just is required to notify Congress, and he doesn't even have to do all of Congress. He can just notify maybe Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Relations Committee that troops are abroad, and he has to consult with Congress when possible. Now, where he has to start to get permission is if he wants to extend how long the troops are there beyond 60 days. So the War Powers Resolution is going to limit the number of days troops could be abroad without approval from Congress. So after 60 days, he needs to get either a congressional extension of that time or a formal declaration of war. So Congress can extend time or withdraw the troops at that point. So the 4 provisions of the War Powers Act just limits the president's ability to deploy troops. That no way does, in shape or form, does the president ever have to ask permission before deploying the troops. He just has more constraints to doing so.